The primary thing that emerging market companies need are human resources, people who have technical skills. And by technical skills, I don't just mean science and engineering, although that is in dire need, but skills in basic technical functions of business, such as finance, accounting, the application of information technology to management practice and to strategy. Not knowing about computers or programming computers for their own sake, but to leverage this emerging market company and achieve greater efficiencies. From my own work, sometimes it's such a waste of talent when you see the lack of efficiency and the inability to use people where they could best be used. What we ultimately need are managers who understand something about metrics. How do you measure? How do you measure performance? How do you measure the return of an investment in machinery, in training, in other words, in human capital? And at the end of the day, I think any human resource executive has to find managers across the spectrum for a company, whether it's a marketing manager or a manager of finance who has some basic knowledge of finance. And the reason I say that is there are all new approaches now to marketing. We're moving away from the idea of taking out huge expensive advertising campaigns on television, and instead people are experimenting with all these social networking media, and it seems like advertising may shift more to Facebook than television, for instance. And there's a lot of growth and interest in emerging markets such as India in social networking sites, and it may be much more cost effective. So the question though for an executive is, are they able, do they have the skills, the technical skills, to measure the return on various let's say approaches to doing marketing campaigns on Facebook versus getting a Twitter presence versus still taking out print ads or television ads. So that's just one example how you need these basic technical blocks such as finance, and you would need the same thing, of course, before you decide, do we enter another country? Because increasingly emerging market companies themselves are entering other countries, even advanced nation economies such as the US. So there needs to be some metric to measure what is our prospective return on investment. Often the top leaders and the top human resource managers of the large companies in emerging markets are aware of the need of technical talent. It could be the talent I've been speaking about, people that are technically trained in finance and accounting and information systems and applying information systems and information technology knowledge to the business enterprise, as well as scientists and engineers who are doing the basic research and development functions, because ultimately a firm can only survive in a global marketplace if it innovates, if it has some creative research and development. Now, the great problem is, first of all, because many of these emerging markets are still quite poor financially. You know, often we wax eloquent about how large their middle class is or how wealthy they are. The fact is they're emerging, but they're emerging from poverty. Given that, they often don't have educational systems that can reach a decent sized percentage of their population. They have people are as talented as anywhere else and as intelligent, but a small sliver would be reached, say, at a high university level or graduate level with technical education. Compounding that is a brain drain. There are so many opportunities in the wealthier nations, such as the US, such as in Europe. Even in a slow economy, there's still this hungering for people that really are good at science and engineering. There's still a tremendous shortage around the world. So if the person who is talented and is trained well in a science or engineering or technical topic in an emerging country, and if they would like to stay and help economic development in their country and help the local companies grow, often the income differential is so large, the ability to move to another country and even ultimately help the remaining family by repatriating some of that large income back to their original country to help family and build orphanages. So there's a brain drain even of a group of technical workers of which is already a shortage. And it isn't really just for highfalutin businesses. There's, a shortage of nurses in rich countries around the world, not just in the U.S., but Germany and the U.K. And the very few nurses that are trained at a high level in Africa, many of them are recruited away with the very high incomes they can earn in these advanced economies. So there is a dire need for more education and more training in developing nations, but also for incentives and mechanisms that there would not be as much of a brain drain. There's a plethora of relationships between business and government regulation in emerging economies. There are well over 100 economies that could be described as emerging, although frankly many of them are still mired more in a situation of some poverty and people don't want to use the word anymore, but a somewhat underdeveloped economic status. So maybe there are 40 or 50 nations who could truly be called emerging markets. In other words, it goes well beyond the Chinas and Indias and Brazils. Now, given this, again, there's a whole plethora, as I said, of relationships, some where business really has the upper hand, to other ones where the government so overregulates that it ossifies the entire ability not only to do business, but to attract things such as foreign investment that could create jobs or bring in new technology or new and better management practices. So obviously there has to be some kind of balance, some kind of optimal balance between business being able to have some say over what they consider the most efficient practices, but also government making sure that business is leaving some value added behind for the society and not just exploiting the society or its natural resources. Often in the past, we have leaned into a direction of where businesses overregulate. Sometimes it also gives them a more clear path to corruption because they have the power through regulations to ask for bribes or to ask for favors for family relatives. In a more free and open environment with less regulations, there's less of an opportunity for government to say we're going to treat you differentially toward these regulations. Sadly, we had moved in the 1990s toward a situation, I think, of more of a balance. But particularly in the Americas, we do see a swing back toward the left, toward a lot of government control. Many nations in Latin America seem to be moving away from the market or from foreign investment as a tool that could create jobs, that could bring in technology. So I'm personally not someone who says let the free market reign. You do need some government controls, you need safety considerations, you need the protection of labor and the environment. But on the other hand, because there are something like 200 countries out there, if a country over-regulates, and especially if it uses that as a mechanism to increase the opportunities for corruption by the government, a global corporation has 200 other nations that they can bring their capital to and create jobs. So it's a playing field that is still working itself out, but we are right now in a swing of the pendulum toward the left, toward more government involvement in the economy. Interestingly, in the United States, as well as throughout the Americas, to a certain extent in the whole world, but I think focused on the Americas. The emergence of a robust middle class in India and China really is one of the game players of the 21st century. There's all this talk about 300 million middle class people in India, 300 million middle class people in China, which is quite interesting because the entire population of the US is 300 million. Well, this tells us two things. One is they really aren't middle class to the extent a US person is middle class, because the US economy is still much bigger, for instance, than China's economy. So if they had 300 million people at our middle level, at our average level, just those 300 million would be as big as our economy. And they have a billion other people, since they have 1.3 billion people. So when we hear about middle class in India and China, from the perspectives of a European or someone in Japan or the US, we should really consider it lower middle class. But lower middle class is very interesting from a business standpoint. And therefore, that's why I say it is the game changer, perhaps, for business in the 21st century, especially because with economic growth in China and India, and they're still growing even in 2009 in the face of what is otherwise a worldwide recession, they will move from a lower middle class into a lower middle class. And these movements, or even from poverty into a lower middle class, moves you into the realm of, I can afford a cell phone and cell phone service. I can move toward affording a very small car and the oil that will be consumed as I drive that car around, and the steel that will go into the production of that car. So we are moving, and we're seeing that in terms of the sales of cars in a place like China beginning to exceed the sales in the US for the first time. But we also see it in terms of this, the explosion of cell phones and even internet-enabled cell phones in China and India. When you look at a company, well, let's take an example, a Finnish company, Nokia. Okay, they're not going to make their money in Finland, not enough people. So they expand throughout Europe, they expand throughout the United States, very well known in the United States, but they know a lot of their future growth is China and India. And they've positioned for that, just as the Coca-Cola company has. You don't need to be upper class to afford a branded beverage like Coca-Cola instead of some local unbranded or non-global beverage. But if you're lower middle class, you can afford it. If you're in poverty, you can't afford it, and you'll stay with the local alternative. So the difference is there's a rising middle class in Brazil and Colombia. It's already happened in South Korea. It's happening in Thailand. But we're talking about 20 million people, 30 million people. In the case of India and China combined, we're talking about 500 million people. Within the next decade, hundreds of millions of more to follow them. Probably the world of business will never be the same. And from a humanistic standpoint, it's a wonderful thing because people, by moving out of poverty, they're living longer lives. The infant mortality rates in China and India are plunging downward. So people are living much better lives. It isn't just a matter of some economists saying their gross domestic product is higher, their lives are longer, and their children are living. Foreign investment in Africa right now is one of the most controversial subjects, not just to people interested in business, such as myself, but politicians and people interested in the entire geopolitical structure of relations. Number one, China has a thirst for natural resources. It's understandable. They have 1.3 billion people, rapidly growing their economy, some years at double-digit rates, but averaging at least 8 or 9% a year, and it probably will continue to grow at least 7% a year for decades. Well, what do you do with so many people in such economic growth when people no longer want to just ride the bicycle and they have not just the desire, but they'll have the means to buy a car? Where do the ores come from for the metal? Where does the iron ore come from? Where does the oil come to power these vehicles? Also, as China becomes an industrial, it already is an industrial power, but as it continues to grow, again, where are they going to get the ores for the metals they use? Where are they going to get the fuel? Well, it turns out that Africa is a place where we are finding, not we, but the world is finding tremendous resources, mineral resources. Obviously, they've always had food resources, but also oil resources off the coast of West Africa, but even in places like Sudan. And this is why this is such an important topic geopolitically as well as economically. A country like the United States or a European country is not going to do business right now with the current government in Sudan, not with the genocide going on in Darfur. On the other hand, China is doing business with the current government in Sudan. I'm trying not to say this judgmentally because we have to understand what lies beneath this. A nation of 1.3 billion people feeling that their entire development will be cut off if they don't have access to minerals and to development of energy sources. And Sudan is kind of virgin territory for the development of these natural resources. So what we need is some kind of international dialogue, but maybe more than dialogue. People always talk about dialogue, maybe dialogue with some teeth, where, for instance, China has to be asked to play along with the other nations to say, yes, we're all interested in developing Sudan's resources and having our companies come in. But we can't do that if it props up the Sudanese government. We need to have a common declaration of a basic set of human rights. Otherwise, we're kind of having a race to the bottom. Who will sacrifice any interest in human rights in order to get to the resources first? And Sudan is just an example. There are nations in West Africa as well where the Chinese, or others, I don't want to just again isolate the Chinese, perhaps will play by a different set of rules than, for instance, a U.S. corporation is allowed to play. We have a Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. If an executive of a U.S. corporation is caught in bribery, they go to jail. They don't just get fined. So there has to be, I think, some international harmonization, but there has to be more teeth. You know, people could be talking about Darfur 3 years from now. They've been talking about it for a long time as it is. And the Sudanese government, if they are financially propped up by the Chinese, they may keep going on indefinitely. And meanwhile, the Chinese are getting first shot at these resources, which is also unfair to the many nations and the many companies around the world who will hunger for resources in the future. Yeah, and China doesn't think it has to change, and it seems unlikely that it will change. Again, I think it would take a kind of a more coordinated approach by the rest of the world, because China itself is gaining power. It's becoming the second superpower on Earth, and it doesn't like what used to be the sole superpower and is still the primary superpower, the U.S., pushing them around. And now it has leverage on the U.S. because the U.S. has such huge government deficits, and we have to borrow to cover our government expenditures. And China, because they have a very high savings rate, very much to their credit, has been a big lender to us in buying the debt that the government issues, which means we really, as the United States government, can't go in and tell China that much anymore what to do or what not to do. On the other hand, China knows that one reason it's had such great economic growth and will have it is they benefit from an open trading system that they can sell to rich countries around the world, including the U.S. and Canada and Australia and European countries, in a very open environment where their goods are able to come in without taxes, without quotas. So at some point, it may be that all those markets that are open to China might have to say, you know, we believe in free trade, but we also believe in human rights, and we believe in an equal playing field as to reaching resources, which we would all like, but reaching them once we, as a global group of nations, make sure that the exploitation of natural resources is not either exploiting the people or propping up a government that can exploit the people. An interesting thing about China is in many resources, it has more resources than any nation on Earth. For instance, China has vast reserves of coal. Now, one problem, of course, is they use coal for a lot of their energy, and that's one reason 16 out of the world's 20 most polluted cities are in China. And if you go to China, again, you don't want to judge. And again, China has done some wonderful things, moving hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. Maybe that is a more basic human need at one stage of development. But if you go to China, you realize these are not just statistics. There is a tremendous pollution, not just of the air, but also of the water. And part of that, not all, is due to the heavy reliance on coal, which is not that unusual. China has these vast reserves of coal. They have enough coal to last them for hundreds of years. However, as China has become kind of an industrial supplier to the world, and as they passed the U.S. and became the world's largest producer of steel, for instance, to make steel you need iron ore and coal. And they really don't have iron ore. Now, what's interesting is Brazil does. And in the last few years, you've seen China make many attempts to become much closer to Brazil. Now, I don't think that they're propping up any human rights abuses in Brazil, and it makes business sense from both sides. And it's very much, I think, in the interest of the U.S. to see Brazil develop. It's 200 million people. It's not even barely the second biggest population in our hemisphere. It's by far the second biggest. It's the fifth biggest population on Earth. And it is a large economy that is resource rich. So it's very much in the interest of the U.S. to see Brazil develop. And one way it will develop is by selling its vast resources to the world, iron ore, and now they're discovering a lot of oil. But there is developing a symbiosis, perhaps, between China's needs and some of Brazil's resources. There's also some match between Australia, which has a lot of resources such as iron ore, and China. So what we have in China, for instance, is a nation that does produce a lot of rice. But, for instance, maybe they need soybeans for some more basic proteins. And that is the beauty of free trade, of course, is usually there are many nations that have much more of something than they need, and they're very efficient at its production. Like the U.S. is very efficient at producing, I don't know, cotton or soybeans or graduate education. Jamaica is very good at producing beach holidays and reggae music. And China has its strengths, but also has great needs. But that is also why China is very much benefited if there's a more open global trading system. And I think that does give the world some leverage over China to say there are certain rules that we all abide by, and we don't care how big you are, you have to abide by them too. There is right now so much focus on sustainability and being green and protecting the environment. And I think that obviously is a topic that will last not just from now, but for the rest of time. A lot of people don't realize, for instance, that the world is going to add, for the next few decades, 75 million people a year, 100 more people every 42 seconds. The reason you don't hear it commented on too much is there's the aging of baby booms in Europe, in Japan, in North America. So we think of our populations as aging and maybe diminishing someday. Well, actually, the U.S. population will keep growing every year because we actually do have babies. We don't have the low birth rates of Japan and Korea and Europe and Russia, but also, of course, we're somewhat welcoming of immigrants, although that's always being debated. Still, Europe, Japan, Russia, these are nations that are or will suffer population declines. So how does the world add 75 million people? Of course, that is why emerging markets are so interesting to business. They're not only adding 98% of the world's population growth, but as we spoke about, so many people are moving from poverty to lower middle class and therefore able to buy so many products of the big global branded companies. Now, let me move beyond talking about green, though, and sustainability, because it seems that everyone is talking about it. So something of particular concern to me is gender equity. They get it right in a place like Sweden, where if you look at their parliament, I think it's more than half women. So it isn't just some lip service. Here's a picture of our vice presidents, and there's always going to be one woman and probably one person of color. But it's surprising usually if there's two women. Or here's our board of directors, and there's always one woman, and maybe increasingly two, as long as they have at least 12 people there. As opposed to a place like Sweden, where, and even Austria is moving toward the types of maternity policies, for instance, that would really give a woman an equal chance to rise up in the workplace and to continue to rise, to leave the workplace if they felt like it and not if they didn't, and depending on whatever they want to do. But if they do leave for a while, to come back in at a level where they can achieve some equity and some ability to rise to the top depending on their own talents. And this is still something that's greatly needed throughout the world, and even most developed countries. And the U.S. has made tremendous strides, but needs to continue to make more strides. We're not at the level of any Scandinavian nation yet when it comes to equity. But particularly, firms have to think about, I believe, the life cycle of for instance, a woman? Does she have the same opportunities? Does she have the same expectations placed upon her as a man who maybe enters a firm? And does she have enough role models? And as universities, we have to think about that. There are role models. There's professors in comparative literature departments or Spanish departments, but do we have enough role models? Do we have enough tenured women in business schools? We're starting to have more in medical schools, but now 50 or 52% of the people entering medical school are women. Are there enough senior women? Has there been equity to get to the truly senior posts? So there are role models. So a young woman entering medical school says, I can be a scientific researcher as well as a doctor. I could one day be the dean of a medical school. You know, so developing, I think, role models in a broader range, and not just mentors, but role models. You know, role models even back into middle school. You know, do young girls think I should stick with math or with science, and not kind of have symbols that I should move into something? We still need to go a long way in that, and firms have to be the leaders. Firms, for instance, to give a concrete example, have to carve out time for their women executives, for their women who are doing research and development, their scientists, to go out. And I think my unique contribution here is I've been hearing about people going out to high schools once in a while. I think you actually have to go to middle schools. The biggest misconception American businesses have about doing business globally is that it's risky. Now, of course, there's some risks involved, but there's also a lot of risks involved in doing business in the U.S., especially as a finance professor as well as an economist. You know, we always talk about diversifying. What if the U.S. economy does poorly? Well, certainly China and India are emerging markets. They're not fully advanced, but they have a lot better growth prospects than the U.S. economy, for instance. And a truly global company, or a company that tries to begin to unfold a global strategy, they're going to go into some markets that are going to grow very well and succeed, and others won't, but that's why you become a global company. To use one example, the Coca-Cola company, I think, and Nestle may be similar, I think, they do business in something like 200 countries. So certainly some of those will not do well, so there's risks. But the fact is they're spreading out the risk by being in so many countries. And finally, what the misconception is they out there, they're risky. Doing business out there is risky. Well, that implies we're not risky. For instance, the U.S. is the least risky, the most secure, the most favorable place to do business. Now, not only did I argue before that you shouldn't put all your eggs in one basket, but let's examine this basket for a minute. A country that has passed $11 trillion of federal government debt, that could hit $20 trillion of government debt as we end 2014, that's pretty clearly going to hit 18 trillion, at least in the middle of 2013. It's a country that has tremendous government debt, and I haven't even talked about personal debt and how so many individuals over-leverage themselves, and it will take years to work that off. And many corporations, not all, but many corporations have too much debt, or they made their bets based on projections of the U.S. economy that proved to be very rosy, as did a lot of banks, so they took on too much leverage. So if you look at the world, you look at the finances, the public finances and the personal finances of many countries, including many emerging markets, and you see situations that are less risky. You might say these economies and these financial systems actually have better underpinnings than the U.S. economy. If I may say something that may almost seem political at the end of this interview, when I say that the U.S. government will go from 11.4 trillion of debt to possibly 20 trillion, that is not actually a criticism of the government stimulus plan, for instance, because we were in a situation when the government stimulus plan was passed that there were people on television, for instance, talking about a possible second Great Depression, a deflation where prices go down and therefore the prices of homes keep going down, and many homes go below the value of the mortgage and there's more foreclosures. Well, as I speak here, no one talks about a second depression anymore. I'm not saying it's only due to the stimulus. In fact, a lot of the impact of the stimulus is still to be felt, but it's easy to forget how close we were to falling into an abyss, and how very timely and aggressive actions by the Federal Reserve, as well as by the new administration and Congress, not all that I would say are the perfect things as you look back on it in hindsight, but action was taken when we were on a knife edge, when we were looking into an abyss. And now people are talking about, well, does the economy turn around in October or November? Does it turn around very slowly or slowly? And in that regard, I'm actually an advocate of the stimulus, even though it means bigger deficits in the short term, more government spending, some tax cuts, and we would have had large deficits no matter what. If the economy went into a depression and everyone lost their jobs, no one would be paying taxes. So I just wanted to kind of conclude with an overall picture of the United States will be riskier, it will have a lot of debt, but one great thing is I also want to conclude that if people are not optimists, if they're hamstrung by thinking about risks instead of opportunities, not only will they not go global and they'll miss out on most of the great growth opportunities of the 21st century, they won't go beyond their own hometown. And you know, it's a very boring world in your own hometown. There's a whole world out there, 6.7 billion people. And you don't have to be the best at many things. If you can even choose one small sliver and decide that you're going to focus, because that's what you're good at, and try to become the best, then you can leverage that out over 6.7 billion people and have quite a life.